Time then for the press preview. It's our first look at what is on the front of Tuesday's papers in the next 20 minutes or so. We'll see what's making the headlines tonight with the journalist and author Ella Whelan and the columnist and broadcaster Steve Richard. Good evening to both of you. Speak to you in a moment. First of all, let's take a look at some of those front pages for you. We'll start with the Metro. The final lockdown is what they go with. The words of Boris Johnson, of course, that when he eases the third national COVID lockdown and does it properly, he hopes it will be for the last time. The Daily Telegraph also makes that its lead story. The Times reports on new figures that suggest COVID-19 vaccines cut transmission of the virus. Onto the Eye, it's reporting on the new hotel quarantine for people arriving from red list countries, with some passengers complaining of a lack of segregation for higher risk arrivals. The Guardian reports on allegations that former Downing Street advisor Dominic Cummings was involved in the decision to award a government COVID contract to some of his friends. Here's the FT leading with Jaguar Land Rover's decision to make all of its vehicles electric by 2030. The Mirror leads on the Duke and Duchess of Sussex's interview with US chat show host Oprah Winfrey, calling it a royal soap opera. Quite clever. While the Star pours more scorn on the Sussexes, saying their decision might cause a bit of a kerfuffle. And I'm joined tonight by the journalist and author Ella Whelan and columnist and broadcaster Steve Richards. Great to see you both. Thanks for being with us. Well, it's been quite a day, hasn't it? And it's certainly reflected on all the front pages. Ella, why don't we start with the front of the Telegraph? Johnson, this must be the final lockdown. The Prime Minister being extremely cautious.
Yeah, well, the interesting thing is the message from Boris Johnson is kind of being portrayed in two ways. So on the one hand, there's this cautious tone to it. There's the suggestion that this isn't going to be something that's going to magically happen overnight, that we're not going to see restrictions lift automatically, that there is going to be very much a step-by-step process, a staggered approach. And then on the other hand, so what I mean is that's kind of, in some ways, depressing, because I think lots of us are hoping for a dramatic change at some point. We just want to get back to normal, as it were. And then on the other hand, there's a kind of excitement in some of the front pages tonight about the prospect of things reopening. And, you know, the Telegraph says that hopes begins its column with saying hopes were dampened of a rapid reopening in time for Easter. And that is kind of, we have to maintain some kind of sense of perspective, I think, in all of this, because while Boris Johnson has said that this must be the final lockdown, without sounding petty and without downplaying the challenges that the government has faced in the last year, coming up to a year now, we do have to remember that we've heard this before, and new strains notwithstanding, the government has form on rowing back on promises that it's made, whether it be to lift restrictions as soon as vaccine targets are met, or whether it be to promise to have schools reopened. I think we should tread carefully into reading any kind of excitement among ourselves into what Boris Johnson is saying. That being said, I think actually in a positive way, the pressure is on by the successes of the government. In fact, the fantastic success of the vaccine rollout has meant that the prospect of us opening up is plausible now. It isn't crazy to say that we might start making plans for May and June, July of summer holidays, that actually normal life is within reach. And so I think we should try and reinvigorate a sense of why that is important, of why actually we should put the last year behind us. Yeah.
Steve, I mean, the government has had its fingers burnt before, hasn't it? And Boris Johnson clearly very keen not to overpromise and underdeliver. Would you say this approach is the right one?
In fairness to Boris Johnson, when he made the point about this being, he hopes, the last lockdown, it was to justify caution, belatedly, from him, in explaining why they were going to move cautiously out of this lockdown, because he didn't want another. But of course, he was asked, how can you guarantee there'll be no lockdown? And this time, compared to other times when he said it would be the equivalent of pushing the nuclear button, he said he couldn't. Of course he couldn't guarantee it because of the variants and all the other problems. So he does appear to be trying to adopt a more cautious approach. The test will come in the coming weeks and months. A week today, we'll be getting the broad timetable from him out of this. But I think a lot of that will be vague, and rightly so, because as he said, again in a change of tone, they need to look at the data before making decisions. They haven't even fully decided what they're going to do next Monday because data is still coming in. Now, that is a more sensible approach, it seems to me, than the sort of reckless gung-ho, let's have Christmas, let's do this, let's do that, which punctuated 2020. Let's see, it'll be under huge political pressure to go much faster. But so far, because he wants this to be the last lockdown, he's moving quite cautiously, it seems.
Yeah, we're bringing the front of the metro. Ella, I can see you're desperate to get in there, so just make your point.
No, I mean, linking to the front of the metro, I mean, in here they quote, down at the bottom, they quote Boris Johnson saying that the moment now is to accelerate. So you see what I'm kind of talking about in terms of, you look at things, the different perspectives, either this is a time to accelerate or it's a time to be cautious. And I think the government has kind of played both those lines again and again across the space of the last year of not exactly mixed messaging, but kind of leaving themselves open to have all avenues, which, okay, as Steve's saying, maybe is fair enough. But I mean, the thing that makes it different from Christmas now today is that we have a huge amount more data, and crucially we can't underplay not just the success of the vaccine in protecting the elderly and the vulnerable and, you know, getting us to the position that we are now where we can see a light at the end of the tunnel, but actually being the reasoning behind the light at the end of the tunnel, because the whole point of lockdown restrictions wasn't to eliminate coronavirus from the population completely. It was based on a fact of, it's always been about the very noble and very sensible aim of protecting the section of our society for which this virus proves, you know, fatal, deadly, and can make people really ill. And so once you have a certain amount of that, you know, the right amount, the safe amount of that section of society, they're saying the 9 top priorities on the priority list, vaccinated, then the pressure is on to start lifting restrictions. And I mean, the letter from the COVID recovery group, you know, headed up by Steve Baker, 60 or so Tory MPs pressurising the government to make promises that they will begin to rapidly revert back on some of the laws that have been instituted criminalising normal behaviour for good reason over the last year. And that to me seems eminently sensible, because it's not like Christmas where we're just kind of taking a punt. We now have the hardcore data and the kind of different position of being sure in the knowledge that we have had this vaccine rollout and that it has been successful. And so let's keep it moving.
Yeah, let's have a look at the front of the Manchester Evening News, because they have a reminder that we are far from over this crisis and still patients keep on coming is their headline. They've done an investigation on the front line of hospitals in Manchester. And Steve, I suppose it's worth making the point that the public support the restrictions still. Support for lockdown is still very high, isn't it, amongst the public?
Yeah, and unsurprisingly, in my view, I don't think on the whole voters have this kind of libertarian streak and horror of kind of state intervention that a group of Boris Johnson's parliamentary party clearly has. I mean, obviously there are issues about the economy, but in the end it is the virus that's wrecking the economy, not the measures aimed at dealing with the virus. And it was interesting reading, we got the papers in first of all about this must be the last lockdown, vaccine targets met, etc. And then you get that paper in outside London with a reminder of the level of hospital admissions still being high. And I was very struck hearing one of the many scientists that dominate the airwaves these days saying that the hospital admissions are such that if we weren't in lockdown now, we would have to go into lockdown. So although the vaccine news is fantastic and potentially liberating, we're not through this yet. And it's an interesting contrast, as incidentally are the stories about the chaos at airports as this attempt to quarantine people coming into the UK tries to come into effect. So this is still a multi-layered challenge on many levels.
And Ella, why don't we finish on that point about quarantine hotels, because they started as well today, you know, there are concerns that they won't work necessarily. I mean, already there's a great deal of criticism about how they've been planned and how they're operating.
Well, it's one of those things that in practice, it seems eminently sensible to manage and control who comes into the country on the basis of these red lists because of the nature of fears of new strains and the way in which this virus seems to be working. But in that in theory, I mean, that kind of seems sensible. But in practice, what's happened is a kind of, would you call it scattergun? It certainly seems to be a rather rash decision to implement these, and without any kind of, most people are saying, well, I've had 1-2 tests, they've come back negative. Why am I then still being penalised? There seems to be a kind of, as has been with many things throughout this lockdown periods over the last year, a kind of blanket approach to something which could do with a bit more of a focused approach. And people are complaining about the price. Obviously, people are also complaining about being stir crazy. I'm not opposed to quarantine in principle because I think it's a good tool in order to stop the spread of virus and maintain some control over what's going on in relation to the virus entering the country or not entering the country. But it does seem like another one of these things that's been implemented rashly and in practice seems to be causing a lot of pain for people who don't necessarily need to be in quarantine. Why, if you've taken several tests and they've all come back negative, does it make any sense to keep people in quarantine?
OK, well, we'll lots more to discuss after the break. For now, Ella and Steve, thank you very much indeed. Coming up, couple expecting a baby to go on TV talk show. Well, that's one way of looking at it, I suppose. We'll have more on that after the break. Hello again, part two of the press preview. Ella and Steve still with us. Steve, let's look at the front of The Guardian. Dominic Cummings, he's out of Downing Street, but he's still in the papers.
Yeah, he is. And this is a story of considerable significance beyond actually Dominic Cummings. It's about the government awarding contracts in that sort of panic-stricken period when they were trying to get equipment over and all the rest of it. This is a specific contract to a company, and I think Dominic Cummings justifies it because they needed to get opinion and focus groups and all the rest of it done, who happened to be run by former colleagues or friends of his. But a huge amount of this went on. The government's defence is it was an emergency and it was all hands to the pump. But a pattern has recurred frequently of huge amounts of money, in inverted commas, taxpayers' money, being doled out indiscriminately, it seems, to friends of or former colleagues of people within Number 10 and the cabinet and so on. And this is now, I think, becoming a sort of bigger story. And it's made the front page of The Guardian, but I think it will be a recurring theme, especially when an inquiry is conducted into what happened in the spring of last year specifically, as part of the broader inquiry.
Yeah, in a witness statement, Dominic Cummings says, obviously, I did not request Public First be brought in because they were my friends. It was the only company with the expertise to carry out the required focus groups urgently. And Ella, I mean, the government was using these emergency regulations, which they were entitled to do.
Yes, they were entitled to do, and on the basis of setting their own rules around it. I think the thing that makes this so irksome is not just the kind of pointless statements from Cummings that he promises this wasn't about benefiting friends, but because the reliance on focus groups, for example, tells you something about the fact that the government might have blown all this money on asking the public in this very kind of Cummings-like way of sort of her behind closed doors kind of managing how people behave, when in actual fact, the one thing that's been really important, parliamentary scrutiny, whether it be about how things like this get done or what new laws get passed or what regulations are going to be in place next week, has been severely lacking. So in terms of actually having public engagement in the lawmaking process, in politics in general over the last year, we've been kind of absent, yes, for understandable reasons because we're in an emergency, but when things like this come to light, it makes it all the more it reveals actually the bigger problem, which is that there has been a tendency to rely on things like focus groups or polls, rather than actually having the proper means through which democracy is meant to work. OK, let's finish with a story on the front of the Daily Star. We've been reporting this as well this evening. Quite an interesting, quite a clever headline, really. This might cause a bit of a kerfuffle. Publicity-shy couple to tell all to Oprah. Yes, really. And there's a picture of Harry and Meghan there with their eyes blacked out. Steve, what do you make of all this?
I think it raises the question, what is celebrity in this modern age? I remember Woody Allen in an interview once saying that in America, if someone gets kidnapped and emerges safe, he's offered a chat show or she's offered a chat show. And this duo who no longer can claim to be royal, even though that begs questions about what is celebrity, being born into a family, but they're not even that. So on what basis do they claim this platform? And there is no clear answer to that. That they have a platform, I've got no doubt. No doubt there will be a huge audience for this interview, but it's a good cover because publicity shy is not quite what they are, whatever they are.
What will the Queen make of this, Ella?
Oh, who knows? It's good fodder for the Crown, isn't it? But one of the things, I mean, this is the brilliant thing about British newspapers. There have been discussions about consent, and some people are saying the difference here is that she's consented to it. I don't quite buy that. I think that Steve's right. This is a couple that are particularly engaged in pursuit of celebrity. But one thing you have to say about British newspapers is they know how to make a joke. There's been several engagements of Mickey taking at the pair's expense. You know, you can't shy away from publicity when you don't want it and then try and flaunt it when you do. And I don't think the British public is quite good at tearing people down, sometimes for bad reasons, but sometimes when they deserve it.
Ella, Steve, we must leave it there. Thank you both.